In late 2025 and early 2026, the Islamic Republic of Iran faced an unprecedented convergence of internal crisis and external confrontation. Decades of economic strain, worsened by international sanctions, a collapsing currency, and rising inflation, had already fueled the largest nationwide protests since the 1979 revolution. In hundreds of cities, demonstrators demanded change, and the government responded with violent repression and one of the longest internet shutdowns on record to prevent communication and reporting. As these internal pressures mounted, Iran's long-running geopolitical conflicts, particularly with Israel and the United States, escalated into overt military confrontation. On February 28, 2026, Israel, reportedly in coordination with the United States, launched a major military offensive against Iranian targets in Tehran and elsewhere, identifying it as a preemptive effort to halt what it considered an imminent nuclear threat. The operation struck key military and nuclear infrastructure, and, according to some reports, may have killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a development Iran had not officially confirmed at the time of reporting. In retaliation, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, declared all U.S. and Israeli forces in the Middle East legitimate targets, launching missile and drone attacks against bases and facilities across the Gulf. Iranian strikes hit U.S. military installations and cities in Gulf Cooperation Council states, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, and even targeted Israeli cities such as Tel Aviv, resulting in casualties. This back and forth has spilled beyond the narrow border between Tehran and Jerusalem, drawing in regional capitals and alarming neighboring nations. For the first time in years, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states publicly condemned Iranian attacks on their soil and vowed support for defensive measures. Emergency alerts were even issued in the United Arab Emirates, urging civilians to seek shelter amid missile threat warnings, a stark illustration of how the conflict's fallout now directly affects daily life in countries previously seen as stable. The recent military escalation is rooted in a long history of mistrust and shadow conflict between Iran and Israel. For decades, this took the form of proxy engagements. Iran's support for armed groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and various militias in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and Israel's targeted strikes against Iranian-linked military assets across the region. These clashes rarely involved direct confrontation until the massive exchange of strikes in 2025, when Israel carried out its most serious direct assault on Iranian territory to date, prompting Iran to retaliate with ballistic missiles and drones. Iran's relationships with Arab nations have historically been complex and often adversarial. Through much of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Iran's Shiite-led theocratic regime was viewed with suspicion by Sunni-majority Gulf states, especially during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and later when Iran expanded its influence in Iraq and Syria. However, a significant diplomatic moment came in 2023, when Iran and Saudi Arabia, long rivals, agreed to restore diplomatic relations brokered by China, signaling a desire to reduce direct confrontation with Gulf neighbors. Despite that rapprochement, the outbreak of war with Israel has reignited regional fears. Arab governments, which once quietly welcomed limits on Iranian power, are now anxious about wider instability, not just because of ideological opposition to Iranian influence, but because regional security and economic growth depend on stability rather than open conflict. The economic stakes are enormous. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which more than $500 billion worth of oil and gas passes annually, is a critical artery for global energy markets. Any disruption there due to military escalation could spike global fuel prices, strain supply chains, and deepen the economic consequences of a prolonged geopolitical crisis. International diplomacy remains deeply divided. Western powers, including France, Germany, and the European Union, have condemned both Iranian retaliation and the U.S.-Israeli strikes, calling for restraint and the resumption of negotiations. Meanwhile, Russia and China have urged an immediate halt to military action and a return to diplomacy, emphasizing the dangers of regional war. At its core, the conflict reflects a broader struggle over nuclear proliferation, regional power, and international security. Iran has repeatedly said its nuclear ambitions are peaceful, but its enrichment activities and refusal to accept strict international inspections have hardened Israeli and U.S. perceptions of threat, prompting preemptive military planning and, indeed, execution. These strategic differences have repeatedly derailed diplomatic efforts and fueled distrust. For the people inside Iran, these international clashes compound deep internal stresses. The crackdown on protests for freedom and economic reform earlier this year has already cost thousands of lives and deepened public resentment toward the theocratic leadership. Many Iranians see both domestic repression and external conflict as interconnected, signs of a government struggling to maintain control at home while confronting powerful adversaries abroad. So what could this mean for the world? If the conflict continues or expands, the consequences could be far-reaching. Global energy markets could be disrupted if the Strait of Hormuz becomes contested or partially blocked, pushing up oil and gas prices worldwide. Economic instability could spread to emerging markets already grappling with inflation and supply chain issues. Military alliances could shift. Prolonged conflict might draw in U.S. forces more deeply, strain NATO ties over Middle East strategy, and push nations like China and Russia into more overt roles in regional security. A broader Middle East war could lead to mass displacement and humanitarian crises, affecting millions beyond the region's borders. A direct confrontation between major powers over this conflict, even if unintended, could alter international relations for decades. The situation remains highly fluid. Diplomacy, domestic politics, regional rivalries, and global economic pressures will all play a role in determining whether this conflict escalates into something still more dangerous, or whether cooler heads, international mediation, and internal dynamics within Iran and its rivals produce a negotiated respite. Either way, the events unfolding now are not isolated. They are connected to decades of rivalry, mistrust, and competing visions of the region's future, and they could influence the world in profound ways for years to come.